Hi to anyone who's already with us. We will be starting in just a minute. Please forgive us for everyone who's on time. We will wait a few more seconds because we still have people joining, and we will be beginning shortly. Rabbi Streer, good evening. I think we can go ahead and start. We don't want to have people waiting too much, and the number of attendees seems to be stabilizing, so I think we are ready to start.
Great. Thank you, Itai, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to acknowledge a number of Jewish Colorado staff who were diligent in making this possible. I want to acknowledge Adina Siegel, our Director of Israel and Overseas, Joe Duberoff, our Director of External Affairs, Stephanie Geller, our Director of Operations, and Aaron Claflin, our Facilities Director as well. And of course, Itai, our Shaliach, for taking the initiative along with Dina to assemble a very important presentation to enable us all to consider and strengthen our ability to speak for Israel and against the, if I can say, the absurdity of the Amnesty International report. These are challenging times, as we all know. There's information and there's misinformation. And the Amnesty International report on Israel, coming from an organization that in many circles receives perhaps undue credibility and is seen in many corners as being a voice advocating for the downtrodden. They have, I would say, overstepped and have continually overstepped in their approach to Israel. And much of that has been further promulgated by the claims and the misinformation that's found in the report. And so we felt it was critically important that we give community members like you the opportunity to hear an analysis and to come to understand our perspective on the Amnesty report and the fallacies held therein. So without further ado, I'm delighted again to thank Itai Davinsky, our community shaliach, our Israel emissary made possible by the Jewish Colorado in partnership with the Jewish Agency for Israel, who will walk us through the Amnesty report, key elements of it, and provide us with important insight and understanding as to that misinformation. So thank you, Itai, for putting in the work, and thank you in advance for sharing your perspective on it.
Thank you, Rabbi Strier and the rest of the team. Before we jump in, I just want to say that I am proud to be part of a community and an organization that makes it clear that we stand with truth and we stand with the Jewish people. And I think that that is what this convening and this evening is all about, just standing together. And before going in, the plan for tonight is not to go over the 250 pages of the report or even the 30 pages of the executive summary for a very simple reason. That is not where the impact of a report like this lies. People are not going to read all the facts and statistics that are in there. And I would even dare to say that governments probably will not either. The damage and the danger in a report like this is in its title. The title that this report has, claiming that Israel engages in apartheid and in crimes against humanity of apartheid. That claim right there, the title, that is the issue, that is the danger, and that is what matters. And when a report like this comes out, we can very easily see, and it's not hidden, of course, they say this, that the idea behind it, the motivation of the organization, of this organization and others who do the same work, is not only to show it to governments or committees or the United Nations, but also to impact the public perception and public opinion. And that is what matters. And one of the avenues in which they try to impact public perception is by putting out a video. So the same day that they put out the report, they put out a 14-minute video which details the main claims that this report claims in an easy to follow, easy to understand, and very impactful with graphic images in the background, very impactful 14-minute video. And my plan for us tonight is to watch that video together. I will be stopping many times along those 14 minutes and trying to show the context that is taken out of the situation which is being shown, or the context that is taken out of the so-called reality that is being portrayed. And I want to be very clear, when I say context, I don't mean, yes, we are committing we are committing crimes against humanity, but look, there is a reason. That is not what I am here to say tonight. I am here to say that the reality that they are showing is, just as Rabbi Strier says, absurd. It's simply disconnected from any real representation of reality. Before getting into the video, another thing that I think is important to say, and it relates with the impact of this video, is that they come out and say in the report and also in their communications that they are not making a comparison to South African apartheid, but rather they are simply looking at the definition, the accepted definition of apartheid. That is a big problem because it's nonsense. It's simply nonsense, because once you say apartheid, everyone, every decent human being, especially in the Western democratic countries, everyone knows what that means. And on the one hand, saying apartheid, and on the other hand, saying, but we don't mean to compare to South Africa, that is ridiculous. And if you don't mean to compare to South Africa, then please forgive me, but this is not apartheid, because that was apartheid. That is what apartheid looked like, which was in South Africa. And that is simply nonsense to say that they are not comparing. By definitions, once they use the word apartheid, they are comparing. I would say now going into what I see as the main flaw of the report. And again, I say we are going to go into the claims of the report tonight, but really the damage is done once the title is out there. Israel is portrayed as a horrible state. And not only that, but Jews around the world are put in danger after something like this comes out. We've seen it time and again. And we should not, that is the main reason why we should not be silent, because this puts Israel in danger and it puts Jewish communities around the world in danger. As we saw last May, when there were things going on in Israel on the ground, people were attacked in California and in New York and everywhere else. So these things, unfortunately, even if they say that this is not against the Jewish people, the repercussions of their claims, their misleading claims to the general public are, of course, dangerous to Jews. The main flaw that I see in this report is the very, very, very basic misunderstanding. And I'm being naive here. I'm saying misunderstanding. I'm not saying that they are doing this deliberately, but one could argue. The main flaw is that they are ignoring a conflict between two peoples. There is one land and there is a conflict which is not new. It has been around for many, many years. It has been, there have been dozens and dozens of attempts to find a solution to this conflict, led by Europeans, led by the US, led by the UN. The UN had several committees before 1948 that tried to give a recommendation on the way to resolve this conflict. But it has always been clear that this is a conflict. There's a conflict between nations. And what this report does is ignore that completely and treat the situation as if this is a government and its citizens, where for almost 2 million Arabs who are Israeli, who live in sovereign Israel, that is the situation. And anyone who's been to Israel knows that using the word apartheid is completely ridiculous. There is no racial aspect to this. Using the word racism and using the word apartheid is a great way to motivate good intentioned people in Europe and the United States, where race is a very, very critical part of the discourse. But in this situation, thankfully, that is not the case. I think the Abraham Accords between Israel and Arab countries show that perfectly. This is not a racial conflict. This is the conflict between two nations over one area of the world, which unfortunately they are both have rights to, historical rights, indigenous rights. The Jews and the Palestinians both have rights, and that's the reality of the basis of this conflict. And it's not, again, a racial one. So having said that, those general general words of what is the main flaw, I am now going to share the video that I talked about. And this is a video that is on Amnesty International's website and YouTube channel. It's something that was put out by them, and I assume reflects accurately what they were trying to claim when they put out this report around 2 weeks ago. So we will start, and as I explained, I will be stopping, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end for some Q&A.
When you hear the word apartheid, what do you think of? Probably the disturbing images of racial segregation between whites and blacks in South Africa, where a regime ruled by a racist white minority declared themselves officially superior to the black majority, then proceeded to dominate them. South Africa's apartheid system officially ended in the mid-1990s, but that doesn't mean apartheid can't happen elsewhere. Here, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are being forced off their land and out of their homes, separated and segregated by laws, walls, and checkpoints. They live in a constant state of fear and insecurity, and deliberately impoverished. While, on the other hand, Israeli authorities have given the Jewish Israeli population privilege over Palestinians in just about every facet of life. The question is, does this all amount to the crime of apartheid? First, the definition of apartheid. The crime against humanity of apartheid is perpetrated when particular serious human rights violations are committed with the purpose of establishing and maintaining a system of domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them.
I want to start with that little opening. Does it really matter what the rest of the video, if the first 50 seconds show everything the way that they portrayed it? And as Rabbi Strier said, Amnesty is an organization that is seen by many as trustworthy. And if these are the 50 seconds of what they are showing to the general public, who of course is not an expert, is not reading the report, is just watching the video, then of course it's very, very clear where this is going. And again, to what I said in my opening, you saw the definition of apartheid, where one racial group dominates another. Here we have two nations. It's not a racial conflict, and we have two nations that are in conflict over, in a long conflict over the same piece of land, with different treaties and agreements governing different areas, which were signed by representatives of Israel and the Palestinians. So obviously, this is taking reality, which is long-standing and complex, and just boiling it down into one very, very small and not even accurate aspect of what is going on the ground. Let's continue.
By one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them. But does this system exist in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
And there's been a growing debate about whether the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories is apartheid. And now is the time for us, as the world's largest human rights organization, to offer up our analysis. Our findings and criticism are directed not at the Jewish people, but at the Israeli state. It's the Israeli state that put in place the policies that implement the laws and the practices that oppress Palestinians.
As I said at the beginning of, before starting the video, intentions are very nice, and stating that the claims are meant only for Israel, that does not change the fact that this puts Jewish communities around the world in real danger. And that is something that they, I hope, will own up to. The serious concerns of Jewish communities when making these false allegations against the one Jewish state.
Well, Israeli leaders have been clear about their intentions from the beginning. In 1948, just before he became the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion visited Lifta and other Palestinian areas near Jerusalem that were completely emptied of Palestinian residents following attacks by Jewish forces. He stated, "There are no Arabs, 100% Jews. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months there will be considerable changes in the country, very considerable, and to our advantage." More than 70 years later, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted on Instagram that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. So, it's no surprise that Israel built a system of racially discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that privilege only Jewish people and Palestinians.
So what they are claiming here is that the fact that Israeli leaders say that this is a Jewish state is in and of itself proof of the system of oppression and domination, as they call it. And I would beg to say that the world is actually made up of nation states. There are 23 Arab states, and I don't think anyone would claim that the fact that they are Arab states automatically means that they have a system of apartheid against anyone who is not Arab. most countries in the world, including Europe, by the way, of course, have a national identity. And in Israel, that national identity is a Jewish identity. Now here, there could be some confusion among people if Judaism is seen only as a religion or Judaism is seen as a race, as the Nazis saw it, then this could lead to false conclusions. But of course, the understanding that Judaism is much more than a religion, Judaism is a people who have a religion, then that is something completely different. And this is, again, I will be naive and say that this is a misunderstanding on their part, and one could easily ask a question. And maybe looking at today's news, would anyone claim that Ukraine wanting to remain Ukraine and not become a province of Russia would be racist or would show racism on the part of Ukraine against Russians? Of course not. Ukraine is a sovereign country. It is legitimate for this country to have its self-identity, which is based on many, many different components. In most European countries, the self-identity is based also on religion, similarly to in Israel, but giving citizens full religious freedoms, just like in Israel. And what they are showing here is that, in fact, they are not speaking about the occupation or the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank. They're not even talking about the treatment of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They are talking about the very legitimacy of the existence of a Jewish state. Because what they are saying, in effect, is that in 1948 and later, when our leaders said this is a Jewish state, that was something that is proof of apartheid.
Well, Palestinians live there too. They were there before Israel was established. But, as we will explain, they've been trapped for decades in a system that treats them as a lesser, non-Jewish racial group. Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestinians comprised most of the population, around 70%, and owned the vast majority of private land, about 90%, in what was British Mandate Palestine. Jews, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, comprised around 30% of the population, and they and Jewish institutions owned about 6.5% of the land.
So this segment was a great example of how the use of language makes a lot of difference. These Jews that came from Europe did not just immigrate from Europe. Many of them are actually refugees. And again, this is a great example of how showing only part of history is a great way to make a false claim, because a lot of the reason why there weren't more Jews in that area is that the arrival of Jews, what we of course call Aliyah, was prevented by the Ottomans at the beginning, and even more so by the British Mandate with the White Books, with the laws in the White Books. And this, I think, also goes straight to the point to remember that the international community did in fact recognize that there should be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And then there were committees and there were decisions and resolutions on how that would be done and what would be exactly the partition. But at the beginning, middle, and end of the day, the international community saw the need and the legitimacy of a Jewish state, a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And the implication made in this segment is, of course, for European colonialism, which again ignores the fact that there are two nations here, Jews and Palestinians, who are both native to the land of Israel. And erasing that history is a big part of the problem with this report.
The port of Haifa in Palestine lies shattered by bombs and strewn with dead.
In the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, Israeli authorities acted to turn the situation on its head and were responsible for the mass expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages, forcing around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. Thousands of Palestinians and Jews were killed in the context of attacks on civilians during this conflict.
So again, using language to not show the truth as it is, in the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state, that is a different way of saying during war. And if you don't say war, then you don't have to get into the history of what exactly were the circumstances of that war. But of course, the circumstances of that war were very important because unlike what is portrayed here, Israel was willing, the Jewish Yishuv, the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish world was willing to peacefully create a smaller Jewish state side by side with a Palestinian Arab state, but that was not possible because Israel was under attack, first by local Arab gangs and later by 5 regular invading militaries of Arab nations around. So again, saying in the course of the establishment makes it sound like something completely different than the context of a war which happened in the context of a world that was completely different than the one we know today, and especially a Middle East that was completely different than the one we know today.
Today there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees who Israel denies the right to return to their homes. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel's brutal military rule, coupled with the establishment and expansion of illegal Jewish settlements, has coerced Palestinians into enclaves, creating further fragmentation and segregation. The objective? Maintain Jewish-Israeli hegemony and maximize control of land. In the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli official policy is to maintain at least a 60% Jewish majority.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Jews who live in the West Bank is a debated issue in Israel. It's a debated political issue in Israel, also around the world, obviously, but more importantly in Israel. And the claims of segregation simply ignore the fact that most of these policies, which they call segregation, are actually policies that many in the international community and in Israel see as justified because they provide security. And even within those parameters of policies that provide security, the trend has been since 1967 and until today, the trend has been for the footprint of the Israel Defense Forces to be smaller and smaller in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, even more so, and we'll get into it in a few minutes, but smaller and smaller to the point where the IDF was not entering Palestinian cities until the second Intifada broke out, and after around 1,000 Israelis were killed, and the IDF went back into operating in Palestinian dominated areas, what we call Area A under the Oslo Accords, which I won't go into this evening. So these claims of segregation simply ignore the fact that these policies have always been based on security needs of Israelis and of the state of Israel.
So where do all the Palestinians live now? 3.4 million live outside of Israel in the occupied territories, mainly in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. 2.5 million Palestinians live in Israel and East Jerusalem, restricted to enclaves that make up around 3% of the entire area. 3 million Palestinians live in the occupied West Bank, but are only allowed to access 40% of the land to live and work. The rest of the area is for the Jewish Israeli settlers only. 2 million are trapped in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Fragmentation of the Palestinian society and the dispossession of their lands are key pillars of Israel's apartheid system to maintain domination and control. But there's more.
So here they bring the claim of fragmentation of the Palestinian people. And again, this completely ignores the fact that there were agreements signed between the representatives of the Palestinians and Israel, agreements that were meant to lead to the establishment of a state. And then, of course, we can go into the debate of whose fault it is that the Palestinian state was never established. And that is a completely fair debate. But to ignore that whole situation where the Palestinian Authority was created to rule over the Palestinians in a temporary situation in the West Bank and Gaza, that is simply ignoring the reality on the ground and drawing a picture of a completely different reality. And as for refugees, the way I see it, the refugees are not a part, do not live in Israel today. There is no one living in Israel under the status of refugee today. And the claim that Israel is not allowing 6 million refugees to return is on the face of it an absurd claim, for the very simple reason that no refugee under the UN rules or treaties that regulate the issue of refugees, except for the Palestinians, refugee status does not go from one generation to the next, but with Palestinians suddenly it does. And I don't think that has a lot to do with this issue that they are bringing, but it does raise the question, why is that difference? Why only in Israel that is the case, where in the rest of the world, refugees are supposed to be resettled in the countries where they arrived, and they're supposed to be able to start a new life there, but not in the case of Palestinians. For some reason, Palestinians in Arab countries and in Palestinian-dominated areas are treated as second-class citizens, and the refugee status goes from generation to generation. On a very practical level, claiming or demanding of Israel to accept the return of 6 million people into its area, of course, is absurd, and it makes it very clear that they again do not accept the premise of a Jewish state, and that is their main problem, that they do not accept that premise. If so many refugees would return in one day, that would of course end the idea of the Jewish state. And if I may add, I think that everything you see in this video makes it very clear that the people who made it are completely opposed to the two-state solution. They do not believe in the two-state solution, which makes sense because they do not see any legitimacy in having a Jewish state in the land of Israel.
The unequal structure of nationality and status, restrictions on freedom of movement, use of military rule, denial of right to political participation or the right to peaceful protest, and cruel separation of families all add to the complex system that we see today.
The world in general hasn't woken up to the fact that there is an entrenched system of oppression against Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, wherever they may live, by the Israeli state. It's a system that's been put in place and maintained for decades, and it's that system that is the root cause of so many of the violations, the misery and the suffering that millions of Palestinians face on a daily basis.
Here, I will just add one quick remark. It's interesting that they say the world hasn't waken up to this situation that they are identifying. The UN Human Rights Commission has a permanent item on its agenda about Israel. Every time they meet, every time they debate, there is condemnation of Israel. So it begs the question, how could that be that the international community has been preoccupied with Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians for decades, and yet has not waken up to this situation? maybe the reason they haven't is because this situation is not real.
One way to understand this segregation and oppression is to look at the ID system. Jewish Israelis have only one ID card, with a status that grants them the right to live almost anywhere they wish in the country. They can move freely with access to healthcare and vast resources. Palestinians, on the other hand, have 4 types of ID cards, if any at all. The kind of ID card you are given determines the level of rights you can enjoy and controls where you can go and what you can do. If you hold a green card, you are subject to military rule. And if you have a green card with a Gaza address, it means you're trapped in a 365-kilometre square open-air prison under Israeli military blockade in place since 2007. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, from children's toys to medical supplies. 90% of the people have no access to safe drinking water, 47% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty. Palestinians with a Gaza ID are forbidden from going to Jerusalem in the West Bank, even if they have family there.
So in this segment, they talk about the Gaza Strip and the people living in the Gaza Strip. And of course, any Israeli would agree that there's a humanitarian crisis there that needs to be dealt with. And then the question is really, how do you deal with a humanitarian crisis in a territory that is controlled by a heavily armed terrorist, religious extremist group? And I think it's ridiculous to ignore the fact that Israel is in conflict with Hamas, who rules the territory of Gaza. And de facto, what happens is that the Gaza Strip is an enemy territory. Of course, I assume, like most of us do, that the people of Gaza would want to change this situation and not be an enemy territory with the state of Israel. But unfortunately, that is the reality, since Israel withdrew all of its forces and all of its civilian presence in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip has been controlled by a fanatic, heavily armed terrorist organization, and they are de facto an enemy territory. And we have fought wars, or we call them usually operations, but they are very, very similar to war. We have fought wars with this territory. We have a border with this territory. And unfortunately, this is the reality, which is caused by the fact that they are an enemy territory. And just to add some historical perspective, in the past, I have family who would go to Gaza to the fish restaurants on the beach, and many Israelis love the beaches in Gaza because they are the most beautiful in Israel. And that was the reality a few decades ago, only a few decades ago. But today it's very, very different. And the fact that they're ignoring this conflict, again, is at the root of the problem with this.
Some people in the West Bank are considered to live there illegally and can be deported immediately to Gaza if found by the army, even if they have been in the West Bank for decades. Whereas, if you hold a green card which has a West Bank address, then you live here. This green card means you can live within specific enclaves surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. And there's a separation wall and fences built around you since 2002, which Palestinians call the apartheid wall. It's 8 meters high in places and 700 kilometers long. That's twice the height of the Berlin Wall and more than 4 times its length. 80% of it is built inside the West Bank, occupying even more Palestinian land. There are separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians, hundreds of checkpoints scattered throughout, not to mention the 54 years of occupation which has devastated the lives of millions of Palestinians. Palestinians with a West Bank ID can travel to Gaza or East Jerusalem, but only if they receive a permit from the military to do so.
The vast majority of these policies that are discussed here in the West Bank, what we call Judea and Samaria, are things that were not in place at the beginning. In the early 70s, they simply weren't in place in the same way they are today. And the reason is terrorism, the first Intifada and then the second, especially the second that led to the construction. Palestinians call apartheid wall, that's fine. Israel calls it a security barrier or security fence. And again, that stems from security considerations. Now, this also, again, brings the same question I brought before. If the idea of the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution is separation, actually a wall, which was opposed by many Israelis for the reason that it creates a de facto international border between the West Bank and sovereign Israel, then why oppose this? And the vast majority of this checkpost that limit the freedom of movement are actually checkposts that limit the freedom of movement between the West Bank and sovereign Israel. Now, again, if a state is established, of course, there will be a border crossing. The crossing of Palestinians into Israel will not be automatic like it is in the European Union without checking passports. So again, this is kind of strange because the whole idea of the Oslo Accords was to create separation, which is what this wall or fence does.
This blue ID is for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can travel to the occupied West Bank as well as to Israel, but they are not citizens of Israel. They have only been granted a residency status. This means that they cannot vote in Israeli national elections, and if they leave East Jerusalem for too long, for example, to study or work abroad or in other parts of the occupied West Bank, their residency is revoked, so they can't return. Since 1967, Israel has revoked the residency status of more than 14,600 Palestinians from East Jerusalem.
Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, which is an area where Israel has applied its sovereignty as opposed to the rest of the West Bank where it hasn't, received a status of permanent residence, which automatically, that status in Israel grants them the ability to request citizenship. That is something that most of them have not done for various reasons. And one of those reasons being that many of them do not want to be citizens of the state of Israel, but actually the numbers of Palestinians in East Jerusalem applying to become citizens is growing for various reasons. And the freedom of movement and the freedom to work anywhere in Israel is completely open to Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And again, as the video states correctly, the only limitation on their rights in Israel is to vote for the Knesset. And again, that is something that they can apply for becoming citizens, and under certain circumstances, they would be eligible for.
Finally, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been through it all. They are the group that remained in Israel despite the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They lived under Israeli military rule that applied only to them and not Jewish Israelis for 18 years between 1948 and 1966. They were made citizens but can never become nationals and enjoy equality unless they become Jewish, which the law prohibits. They are the only Palestinians who can run and vote in Israeli elections, and they can move relatively freely, but the inequality against them was never dismantled, and they face daily institutional discrimination, including as members of parliament.
So here they're making claims about Israeli Arabs who are, their representatives in the Knesset are part of the ruling coalition, who are today overrepresented in medical professions. Last year it was cited in Haaretz that more than 50% of the finishing doctors in medical schools are actually Arab, when they're only 20% of the population. In economy, in culture, in sports, everywhere you look, Arabs are integrated into Israeli society in a growing degree. And it's anyone who's, as I said at the beginning, anyone who's been there knows that this claim is completely absurd. Of course, it is true that until 1966, this was not the situation when it was overturned. And since then, the integration and equality has only been improving, and today is in a situation where it was never as good as today. Again, the use of language, it's you say can enjoy almost freedom of movement. What do you mean almost? An Arab Israeli can go anywhere just like me. Actually, an Arab Israeli can go to Palestinian cities where I am not allowed to. And even if I do it, I will risk my life. So it's not only that I'm not allowed to, it's dangerous. But here, simply putting out the claim that there's inequality and not saying anything about what that inequality is again a part of the problem with this report.
And if this complex ID system wasn't enough to segregate the Palestinian community, in 2002, Israel introduced a law that prohibits family unification. That's right, denying Palestinians the right to live with their loved ones if their ID cards are different. And this woman is one of thousands of Palestinians who Israel will not issue any ID card. She can't travel, can't hug her family, only see them meters away across the border. Putting down roots, the family home, these are crucial parts of what make a strong community. To make sure Palestinian communities can't develop any further, Israel has made it almost impossible to grant building permits for Palestinian homes. So, Palestinians live in a catch-22 situation. In order to have shelter or develop their communities, they must build without a permit. And if they do so, Israel can demolish the structures on the basis that it was built without a permit. Right now, there are over 150,000 Palestinians currently living under the constant threat of demolition and forced eviction, many of them for the second or third time. In the West Bank, an average of 18 Palestinian structures were demolished every week in 2020. The same year, Israel issued 1,094 building permits for Jewish applicants, and only one for a Palestinian. This goes back to the heart of the issue. To maintain the state's character as Jewish, Israel systematically disadvantages Palestinians while privileging Jewish Israelis. This racist privilege has been enshrined in laws, policies and practices, and it enables Palestinian resources to be taken in order to economically benefit Jewish Israeli citizens.
Again, here with building permits is a great way to show statistics that tell a picture that is far from the truth. Israel does not issue building permits in Area A under the Oslo Accords, which is where the vast majority of Palestinians live. Israel only in Area C, where only a small number of Palestinians reside. And the fact that there are 150,000 people under the threat of eviction, as they call it, is a situation that has been from the beginning. There are many reasons for the fact that there are no building permits to the structures, but they're also not being destroyed. Palestinians are not living in the streets. The population is growing and they're living in homes. Today, the European Union is even building structures without permits in Area C. The Palestinian Authority is trying to also start giving permits, although that is under the Oslo Accords was not the plan. So there are many issues with the small number of Palestinians living in the areas that under Israeli civil control in the West Bank, but the vast majority of Palestinians do not live there. And for that reason, the vast majority of Palestinians do not get permits, building permits from Israel. And as to family unification, that is something that is a law that means that Arab Israelis, what usually that means is that Arab Israeli men cannot take second, third, and fourth wives that come from the West Bank and again and West Bank and Gaza, and that does not apply to any other country. So again, we have a conflict which they're ignoring. In the context of that conflict, Israel does not allow its citizens to marry and naturalize people that come from enemy states. But that is something that is completely sensible in any conflict between two nations, unless, of course, you ignore the fact that there is a conflict.
The system of apartheid is the Israeli state's oppression and domination of Palestinians on a daily basis. It's the laws, the policies and the practices that it puts in place and then implements to control Palestinians' daily lives. And then the crimes of apartheid. The crimes of apartheid are those acts, those violations, those patterns of violations that Israel is committing to create and then maintain that system of apartheid.
Amnesty International and other rights organisations have been documenting patterns of human rights violations and international crimes for decades. These are the most visible and violent part of this system. At the end of May 2020, 4,236 Palestinians were held in Israeli prisons, and 352, including 2 children, were held without charge or trial. Between September 2000 and February 2017, Israeli forces killed 4,868 Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, including 1,793 children, outside the context of armed conflict. And Amnesty International is not aware of any case in which an Israeli soldier has been convicted of willfully causing the death of a Palestinian in the occupied territories since 1987. This imbalance of rights, justice and accountability is never more clear than when a Jewish Israeli life appears to have more value than a Palestinian's. Israel's...
So here they say something very different outside the context of armed conflict. They say thousands of Palestinians have been killed outside the context of armed conflict, making it sound like there are Israeli soldiers or civilians going out and just killing Palestinians, a few every day. And when you look into the report, which is what I did when I heard this ridiculous claim, I saw that what they mean by that is that they're saying they were killed in the context of Israeli law enforcement activities. Now, that makes it sound like they were killed in a routine traffic stop. Unfortunately, that is not the case. This is it's not law enforcement, it's a war on terror against armed terrorists who have videos with a flag and weapons decrying that they want to die the death of shaheeds. So it's simply ridiculous to claim that Israel is going out and killing thousands of Palestinians out of the context of armed conflict. That is the context of armed conflict, when armed conflict is between a military and terror organizations that hide amongst population. And the second claim made there, that the life of a Palestinian is worth less. And the proof of that is that no Israeli has ever been convicted of the wrongful killing, or no Israeli soldier has been convicted. That is also a misrepresentation, because just 2 years ago, two Israelis, one minor, were convicted of murder after setting fire to a house of a Palestinian family, and which led to the death of the two parents and one of the children. 3 people died, and they were found guilty of murder. So they weren't Israeli soldiers, but they were Israeli, and the Israeli legal system found them accountable for the crime of murder. We have just a few minutes left for the webinar, and we're not going to watch the last minute of this video. It doesn't add much, it's more of a sums up, and I want to leave some time for Q&A if we have any. So I will stop the video and see if we have any questions come in.
Thank you, Itai. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and being able to explain, what exactly we really should know about how this report is framed. Repeat again that if you do have questions, we do have a few minutes left, but if you do have questions, to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, type in your question and then submit it, and we'll share that. I see we do have one question from Maria, who asks, of those Palestinians living in East Jerusalem who applied for Israeli citizenship, roughly what percentage has been granted? How many have had successful applications?
I don't have the exact numbers, and there are a lot of challenges for Palestinians who want to do that. One, they have to give up their Jordanian passport. Some of them still have a Jordanian passport from between 1948 and 1967, the Jordanians annexed or implemented their sovereignty over the West Bank, over Judea and Samaria. And so some of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem still hold that passport. In order to be able to receive citizenship in Israel, they would have to let that go. And many of them simply do not want to. That's why most don't apply. I don't have the statistic of how many have been granted, but I do know that the numbers of applications are growing. And a lot of the reason why also it's not clear, it's because a lot of this is, there aren't many parallels in Israeli law or international law. And so a lot of this is law that is being decided application by the courts. this goes to the courts. At the beginning, their status was not exactly the status of permanent resident, and then the courts made that. And it seems like the courts are moving in the direction of making the permanent resident status more solid, more permanent, which would make it more difficult for the government to revoke. This is the Israeli Supreme Court. So it's a law that is developing all the time. I don't have numbers. I also don't want to draw a picture that is false. It is difficult for Palestinians to obtain this. Until recently, they weren't really trying. Now, in the last few years, more and more are trying, and maybe things will change as things get to court, and these cases are discussed by the Supreme Court.
Thank you. A couple of questions from Stephen Zimmerman. One about the city of Rawabi, which I believe is sort of a startup within the West Bank. I don't think it's really a part of this report, but I'm not really sure how it fits into this narrative that Amnesty is trying to push. But how do you see that maybe being a counter to it? The way that it is creating sort of a new potential for Palestinians in the West Bank as a hub, as a potential place for employers to be. Love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think anywhere where you see potential for Palestinian prosperity and Palestinian self-governance is a place where it's made very clear where this report gets it wrong. And again, I'm being naive. I'm saying they get it wrong and they don't have any malicious intent. I'm sticking to that. And that is true, in joint industrial areas. SodaStream used to employ Israelis and Palestinians working side by side until it was pushed to stop producing in the West Bank, in the contested area, and it moved its factory to the Negev. Today, Bedouin mothers in Rahat enjoy good job opportunities, but those Palestinians lost them. So anywhere where you see that the Palestinians could thrive and advance themselves and their society, their community, their families, I think is a place where you get that why this report is so wrong.
And he also asked about what Israel is doing to combat this report publicly. I'll say before you answer, Itai, one stark example is that Agnes Kalamard and Philip Luther, who we saw in that video, presented their findings in a hotel in Jerusalem at the beginning of February. I'm not sure if that is really indicative of apartheid, if the country that you're criticizing allows you to have a rather large public event attended by media to make this declaration, really proves that. I don't think you're going to find that in China or the only other country that Amnesty considers to be or has accused of apartheid, Myanmar. I don't think you're going to be able to do something like that. But curious if you have any other examples of how the Israeli government has been countering this report.
Yeah, that is a very tricky issue because as we just saw, the way to counter something like this is going into detail and showing where the reality is portrayed in a way that is simply unreal and absurd, and doing that with an audience that does not have the attention span like the people who joined us here tonight is simply something that is very difficult to do. What the Israeli government usually does is downplay this. Today the Israeli Prime Minister had an historic visit to Bahrain, an Arab country, which Israel now has great ties with. So usually what Israel does is not much. And some people are very frustrated by that, but maybe in communications, that strategy is the one that is better in this case. And again, I'm not sure, but that is usually what Israel does or doesn't really do.
Well, Itai, grateful to have you as my neighbor at work, but also to have be able to have your insights to share and expertise to share with our community on this. And I think we are just at time. We'll give you the last word, and also open up to Rabbi Strier if he wants to share anything before we depart.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'll just finish by saying that, again, this report ignores a long conflict, and the damage that it does is first and foremost to the Palestinians and to the Israelis, because it does not advance the cause of peace. It actually makes it more difficult to reach. And it also harms the millions living under real horrible human rights conditions, which the terms of the important field of protecting human rights, all of that language is simply diluted when it's used in the way that it's used by Amnesty International. So in fact, they are putting Jews in danger, they are putting Palestinians, they are harming Palestinians and Israelis, and also they are unfortunately harming the important cause of advancing human rights of all people wherever they may live. I want to thank everyone for joining, and thank you, Rabbi Strier and Joe, and everyone else who worked together to put this evening together. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.